There are a plethora of strategies for defeating aging. Most of them are bad. If you want more than 5 or 10 years, if you want to live to 160, like Adam likes to say, we need to make some big bets and make some big changes in our technological strategy.
If you look at the current variation of humanity and you say, well, I want to solve aging, but retain everything that's true about humanity right now, your path is more biased towards bioengineering, damage repair, different particular types of replacement or cell therapies. Whereas if you say, I just want to maintain some sort of continuity, and that's my solution to aging, the continuity of some sort of self, then you would be open to a wider variety of interventions.
A cryonics company or a chemical fixation company can come in and perfuse your body with protective chemicals and then put you in some sort of stasis, like a storage, until future medical care can bring you back and fix whatever is wrong with you.
It feels to me that if somebody believed that, it would really be severely unethical for them not to speak out.
The brain is going to be the limiting factor. If you replace all your heart, your internal organs, your arms and legs, your brain will still age at some rate, and eventually you'll die because of that.
On the balance, we are far enough from technological inflection that the primary concern needs to be accelerating progress.
I'm super excited for this episode. Like, seriously, like, this is the podcast that I was waiting to make for the longest time, because I think I have with two people with me here, Kris and Adam, who are the most realistic thinkers in the entire longevity phase, but they're not the people who are like all the time poo-pooing on everything else and never saying anything positive, not positive in a psychological sense, but positive in a creation sense, that, hey, if we explore this path, then they can work. So we have skeptical people with positive statements, if that makes any sense. But let me just demonstrate, or let you demonstrate what I mean by characterizing you like this, by letting you answer to the first question, which is, how can we solve aging?
It's a big question. I'll take a crack at it. So the only way to do it is by developing new technology. And the real question is, what are the technologies that are going to get us there most quickly? And many people have different ideas about ways to make progress and help people live a little longer, but I'll just end by saying we need radical new technology to make difference, the life extending difference that is implied with, true longevity. If you want more than 5 or 10 years, you want to live to 160, like Adam likes to say, we need to make some big bets and make some big changes in our technological strategy.
I would second that. I don't really have much to add. The question then boils down to, how do you accelerate the development of new science and technology at a maximum rate? But I would add one small thing, which is that there are easier paths and harder paths. And when we say solve aging, predicate question is for whom? And that has two options. One option is humans as they are today, within some natural scope of evolutionary variation. And then the other part is something else, which is an evolution of that into some other thing, which may preserve continuity, and where aging is quote unquote solved, but then we're not quote unquote human in the same way. This is a very important distinction, because if you look at the current variation of humanity and you say, well, I want to solve aging, but retain everything that's true about humanity right now, your path is more bias towards bioengineering, damage repair, different particular types of replacement or cell therapies. Whereas if you say, I just want to maintain some sort of continuity, and that's my solution to aging, the continuity of some sort of self, then you would be open to a wider variety of interventions. And it seems to me that we're currently on path number 2 as a species. And it's important to distinguish those because the objective will define the means.
So we are starting from first principles. Pretty good. Okay. I listened to a talk to you in Prospera, Kris, and in that you were saying something very similar, that we have this kind of ways to solve aging. One is stasis, like cryopreservation. The other would be replacements of body parts, and the third is let's call it bioengineering. I would suggest let's go from the more, as Adam referred to them, the wider variety of interventions, and then zoom into bioengineering, which is the most, I guess, mainstream approach here. All right, so what kind of wider variety of interventions are we talking about here?
I mean, there are a plethora of strategies for defeating aging. Most of them are bad. Supplements are bad, not going to work. Kind of traditional drug development's not going to work. So the 3 work streams that you mentioned, biostasis, replacement, and bioengineering, are the ones that we currently think are most plausible to actually make a difference. And by make a difference, I mean, help people achieve radically longer lives, 150, 200 years, something like that, and at a minimum. You said the bioengineering is kind of more mainstream. Everyone would love a gene therapy that keeps you young and healthy. Biostasis and replacement are kind of the weird ones. Biostasis is just a way of delaying aging. So either using cold temperatures or chemical fixation to put your biology on pause. It's technically called metabolic arrest, and that just prevents you from breaking down further. So when current medical care gives up and says, like, we can't help this patient anymore, a cryonics company or a chemical fixation company can come in and perfuse your body with protective chemicals and then put you in some sort of stasis, like a storage, until future medical care can bring you back and fix whatever is wrong with you, whether it's a bad heart or cancer or something like that. So it's not something that solves aging, but it puts you in a position to get to a future where aging is solved.
I just want to highlight that is a potentially controversial perspective, because delaying assumes that there's something that will come in the future that will then allow you to realize the benefit from that delay. And that may be a very far-flung assumption, right? So if you look back and you just say, well, if we completely preserved somebody in a static metabolic state from 50 years ago, would they have benefited? That's a reasonable argument, right? We have new cancer therapies. We have other ways to prolong people's lives today. We have GLP-1s. If you were morbidly obese, now you'll have an easier path to get out of these things. However, when you think about the longer term and, of course, the exponential development trajectory we seem to be on in some dimensions in humanity, it's harder to predict if this will even be relevant in 50 or 100 years, especially if a lot of what's going to happen is this merger with technology, such that it will really be a co-evolution going forward of humans with technology rather than just random mutations and biological evolution as it's been so far. And that's what makes it a little bit, I would say, questionable as something to bucket in the aging category strictly, even when you label it as delay.
Right. Yeah, it's a reasonable concern. Technology will continue to progress up, but perhaps people caring about people in stasis might continue to go down over time as humanity evolves into whatever. And hopefully for the people in biostasis now and people who go into biostasis later, the technology gets to a point where it can revive them before the caring gets to a point where people don't want to anymore.
Kris, I think you said something like in the presentation in Prospero that if anybody wants to hear some crazy stories or crazy things are happening while we are putting people into biostasis, then hit me up after the presentation. Well, I'm doing it right now.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, what are you doing in this? Let's start with that.
Yeah. So there are two ways to preserve someone, put them in biostasis. One is with very cold temperatures, and one is with chemical fixation. And you might think you could just cool somebody.
Before that, what's your involvement in this?
Oh, in cryostasis? I'm an investor in cryostasis companies, but I don't do any cryopreservations myself. I might get trained at some point just because I'm interested, but I have not done any.
A person being cryopreserved?
No, I have not been in any actual surgeries.
Yeah,
No. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
That'd be very interesting. I've seen videos of the equipment and how it's used, but yeah, I've never been in the back of a standby team vehicle actually doing it. But what I meant by crazy stuff, I mean, I've heard crazy stories about that kind of thing because the cultural aspect of it that Adam mentioned is highly applicable to biostasis. People are not used to this kind of idea. It's weird and strange. And if you're a standby team of medical professionals who want to take someone who's, who just died and preserve them in the best way possible, sometimes you're up against a lot of cultural resistance. Like the hospital staff think it's weird. Police think it's weird. You're taking a body and putting it in the back of an ambulance and driving to some parking lot in the middle of nowhere and then doing an operation on somebody. I mean, it's kind of like a compromising situation to be in. If a police officer came knocking on the door and was curious what was going on in the back of the ambulance. But the weird stuff I was implying in that talk was just the weird things that happen to your body when you're put into biostasis. Because it's not as simple as just putting somebody in a refrigerator and then pulling them out when you're done. You have to do what's called vitrification, which takes your biomass and puts it into a glass-like state. And to do that, you have to go down to sort of liquid nitrogen temperatures. But there's kind of a range of dangers on the way down from normal body temperature to a glass-like state. And strange things can happen. Like, for example, if you cool certain organs down too quickly, they might change shape. And if they change shape at different rates, they might press on each other and crack and shatter into pieces. So a lot of things can go wrong if you don't do the cryopreservation correctly.
So, cryopreservation. What other interesting, wider variety of interventions do we have that we should talk about regarding solving aging? For whom?
I would say the next one is replacement. It's still a little strange to people, but it can actually be a solution. And it kind of happens today already. People get replacement organs when they're sick and doctors don't have a way to treat kidney disease or liver disease. But you could imagine that if you had an old kidney that was not diseased and you put in a young one, that would have a big benefit to you from a longevity perspective. And we can't do that now because there's a limit to the supply of organs and they need to go to people who are sick and dying rather than to people who are just kind of aging normally. But you can imagine in a future where we have unlimited organs or like a large supply of tissues, people could get preventative
Free
replacement.
market of organs.
Right. Yeah. You could say, well, my organs are getting a little old. Why don't I get some young ones? And then that could actually have a huge impact on your expected lifespan. Not just, we don't have anything today that can beat that good diet and exercise, but a fresh set of internal organs or new arms and legs could really move the needle, decades.
I want to just dig in on that a little bit. Decades in what? So could you articulate what you're imagining here as a scenario? Because there's been some evidence that when you put in a youthful organ, that organ ages at a considerable faster rate than otherwise in the youthful body, and thereby, reduces the positive impact. And so I wonder, when you say decades, do you mean in terms of mean life expectancy, or do you mean maximum lifespan? And what kind of organ replacement are you imagining in that scenario?
That's a great point. Yeah, if you just replace a little bit of tissue, the rest of the system will kind of overwhelm the benefit. The older organs will sort of bring down the good one. So you have to think about what's the therapeutic dose of replacement that you would need. How many organs would you need to replace? How much of your muscle mass would you need to replace with young tissue to get kind of a systemic benefit where the young tissue actually takes over and makes the older organs perform better? I don't know the answer to that. There are several labs that want to do those experiments and are kind of, prepping to do that work, but we don't know. If I had to guess, I would say probably you need at least a quarter to half of your organs and tissues to get like a big boost. But say you were able to replace all of your internal organs and your limbs. Now, that's quite a bit of mass. And I would expect both average and maximum lifespan to go up at that point. If you have young tissue, you're much less likely to get cancer and cardiovascular disease. But also those young organs and tissues will help support the rest of your body that's not young. So you can imagine you'll still be at risk for neurodegenerative disease, but you'll be much less risk if you have young kidneys and young liver and young immune system supporting that brain.
Could you walk us through that with a little more detail? Let's imagine a scenario, if you don't mind. So somebody comes in and has all of their vital organs replaced. So heart, lungs, liver, maybe kidneys, and then you could live with one kidney, but let's say, the kidney is a vital organ. If you have none of it, you're dead. And probably you want a new thymus, although in that, because you're talking about these visceral organs, you might want to replace them at once. That being said, the immune system also has a lot of other components in the body, whether lymph nodes or bone marrow and so forth. But let's say you replace all those visceral organs and vital organs, and you carry it out with the minimal trauma surgery. I wonder how you think about the implications. And I'll give 2 examples of wrinkles, and I would love to hear your perspective, Kris, both on those and on other wrinkles that you could foresee. Actually, I'll mention 3 wrinkles. One is the trauma of the surgery. So how much evidence do we have about the recovery capacity from that level of surgery, if any? Number 2, a lot of the signaling happens through the blood. So if you're talking about a remote organ, a muscle, part of your musculature in the arm, that really doesn't have any direct relationship with the spleen. Totally different part of the body. The way they communicate is probably through the bloodstream and maybe the nervous system to some degree. So my question there is there something that would need to be done and how much do we understand about the impact scope there? So for example, you could assert, well, even if all your musculature and some of the non-vital organs are still aged, but they're releasing this toxic soup into the bloodstream and a toxic set of messages into the nervous system, then the benefit of the new organs will be substantially degraded. And so it may be that we actually need a blood filtering system or some other mechanism to make sure the blood also doesn't convey those messages, or maybe the nervous system, which I think may be a little harder. And then finally, when we talk about maximum lifespan extension, of course, we have the problem of the brain, which is, if not replaceable, not clearly going to benefit from these additional organs. So to summarize, trauma, the communication channels, blood and neural, and maybe others, if you have others. And what do you do about the brain? And how does that kind of boil down to decades in any plausible scenario?
Sure. So surgical risk is real, and you do suffer some amount of damage from any surgery that you get. But that doesn't have to be the case necessarily. We know in certain animals and in very young humans, if you do a surgery on them, they repair their tissues completely, and there's no visible scarring and no problem afterwards. So our biology does have the capacity to fully regenerate after wounds. It's just kind of locked away in adulthood for evolutionary reasons. So while we can't have a damage-free surgery right now, it's kind of plausible that at some point in the future we'll be able to do that. But I suspect that for certain patients, even accepting the damage from a surgery as it would be performed today would be worth it to get new organs. To your second point,
Hold on. Do you mind if we just stop for a second on this first
yeah,
one?
hit me.
Just to clarify it. So let's just put aside the non-scarring or zero impact surgical case, because even though it seems like it may be plausible, there are tools in biology that may do that. We don't have a timeline on it, unless you do have a timeline. And then, because I'm not aware of the latest research on this stuff, so if you have some timeline, that would be useful to know. Like if you think there's going to be some curve of improvement in the reduction of trauma from surgery. But assuming we don't have that as things are right now, what is your what is an example you could give? Because like, look, somebody has cancer. Sure, you're going to take out their liver. It's a severe liver cancer. It's a severe surgery, but you do it anyway because they're better off with somebody else's liver than with a cancer. 100%. But we're not talking about extending that kind of person's lifespan by multiple decades in terms of like mean life expectancy or maximum life expectancy. We're talking about just keeping this person alive because they're in like a very severe condition and likely going to die in the next, let's say, maximum 5 years. So, you know, just going back to this point about extending by decades, what is any scenario that you can imagine today with a level of surgery or the prospective level of surgery that you can see in the next 5 years or 10 years? And if so, you know, share with us what technologies you think need to happen or are on track to happen that would enable this, you know, decades outcome.
Yeah, I think the main problem now is not the surgery; it's the limited supply. So that's kind of the first problem we need to solve. How do we get large sets of tissues and organs to do transplants with? If we had a new set of organs for you, Adam, I think surgeons today could transplant them in, and you would get I don't know, I haven't done the math to like figure out exactly, but just roughly guessing, I don't know, an extra 10, 20 years expected life expectancy, but your maximum would probably also go up quite a bit.
20 years life expectancy.
Yeah, I would think so.
From, and this is from what organs?
If you replaced all your internal organs and your limbs.
Wait, hold on a second. Yeah. All the internal organs and the limbs you think is doable with current surgical technology without killing the patient?
Yeah, we already have surgeons who perform limb transplants, and we have surgeons who do multivisceral internal transplants. And actually, sometimes when you transplant multiple organs, it's easier than doing them individually. For example, sometimes, you know, multiple parts of your digestive system are transplanted together, not because you necessarily need each of those organs, but because it's easier to put them as a block than to put them individually. The connections make it so it's easier to do them together. Heart and lungs, same thing. So you can imagine that if we had, you know, our unlimited supply of organs, you might just get all your internal organs put in at once with some surgery that had some minimal, you know, connections to your cardiovascular system and nervous system. But we can't do that today because we just don't have the materials. But surgeons could theoretically do it. Now, it's looking toward the future when you want like a minimal, I think you would survive that today and benefit. But we're also making progress on making the surgeries less dangerous, mainly because of surgical robotic platforms. You know, robots are very good at doing surgeries without causing damage. So I think from that perspective, the surgeries will get safer, and then there'll be bioengineering techniques to improve recovery. But I don't really have a timeline for either of those.
This sounds like a very strong assertion, and it makes me want to seek very strong evidence that it's plausible. Are there any top surgeons who you've seen go on record repeating your assertion that they
Which one?
based on based on their experience with surgeons, that full internal organ replacement and limb replacement is plausible to do with the net outcome being not just neutral, but net positive by as much as 1 or 2 decades for the recipient of the surgery. Are there any examples of that?
I don't think so. We know surgeons who do limb transplants. We know surgeons who do internal organ transplants, but I don't think any of them have publicly commented on what they expect the increase in lifespan to be from doing all of those together, or any of them individually.
I mean, right. And I mean, I would say life expectancy, just because I'll give you an example, a very concrete example that I think would maybe be useful. So let's imagine you have somebody who is 70 and, actuarially, they're expected to live with a very high probability to, let's say, 87. Now, they're doing okay. They don't have severe chronic diseases, but they are on the decline with aging on many various, many dimensions. So you can check it functionally, you can check it histologically, you can see that they're declining. So you're making the assertion that some surgeon out there would, regardless, let's say they don't want to go on the record. Let's just imagine that for a second, because it would sound too weird, or they something just is not appealing about that. But you're saying that in their heart of hearts, they would believe that for that 70-year-old, if they only had the organs, they could keep them alive instead of to 87, to 97, or even to 107. It feels to me that if somebody believed that, it would really be severely unethical for them not to speak out. Because at least they should be substantially encouraging organ production and screaming it from the rooftops.
That's every transplant surgeon.
Well, but they're not talking about it as a prophylactic measure or an enhancement measure.
Most people don't have longevity on the mind, right? They don't think about this sort of stuff the way we do.
I don't know about that. If you're treating geriatric patients, you generally, as a surgeon, would think about their expected remaining lifespan as a key consideration, right? Because, you're operating on somebody 75, they're not going to live another 40 years.
I think as a as someone who works in the clinic, you think about your statistics. How many of my patients survive and what are their outcomes like? And you think, after the age of 70, I'm not going to operate on someone because they're going to die, or they're going to have a certain percentage of them are going to die and it's going to make me look bad. Or it's just not a good risk reward for the patient. If you're a little bit younger, maybe the surgery is tolerable. And maybe if you're in your 60s, the surgeon might say, well, actually, you could recover from this and gain a lot. Or maybe if you're a lot older and you're absolutely going to die, then it makes sense again. You have to really think about the trade-offs between the surgical risk and benefit versus the risk of just aging to death.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I quickly looked up the numbers here, and it seems like there were, 108,000 organs transplanted worldwide in 2022. So even if you assume that the average doctor only transplants, I don't know, let's say 30 a year, which seems low to me, that implies that there are only 3,000 surgeons who are doing these transplants at all. I'm actually taking the devil's advocate position here to say that it's plausible that out of 3,000 people, nobody is speaking up because, they have other things on their mind. It seems implausible for whatever reason. They haven't thought about it. They're focused on, their day-to-day kidney transplants, and that's hard enough, etc. It just seems to me like a very tall claim. So I guess it's arguable that whether we would hear this coming from surgeons, but, if I were President Xi or Putin or something like that, and I were able to have as many organs as I want, I believe that this were true, and I went to people and said, give me everything you can. I don't care what it takes. Also, I feel like we would have heard about it But I guess maybe the counter to that, and I wonder if you'll agree with this, Kris, is that it's just so weird to think about that when she goes to his like council of surgeons or council of doctors and says, all right, what do you got for me? Do anything you can. They just think it's too weird to mention it. Even though, on that chat that he and Putin had, they were like, you can replace organs now, et cetera, et cetera. So it's obviously on their mind.
Yeah. Well, they probably don't want to kill him, right? There's some risk she or whoever wants the surgery, right? Like there's always surgical risk and a mortality rate associated with any surgery. And if you're doing a novel surgery, it's even higher. So they might not, find it advisable to do that, even if someone's interested. But who knows? Who knows what people are discussing behind closed doors?
I mean, that just sounds a little hard to believe. You know what I mean?
Which part?
Well, you're saying that there's a psychological resistance to proposing it because in that game mechanic, you might be at risk of harm as the surgeon or the doctor proposing this idea. And I mean, yes, maybe it's plausible in some scenarios, but she isn't the only she. Like there are other leaders, there are other billionaires in places that don't care about human rights. Thousands of billionaires probably in China, or like multi-hundred millionaires who could absolutely afford like doing all sorts of things that would be considered unethical elsewhere in the world. And yet we've heard of nobody try to do this. It just like raises the red flag for me. Like, why is this, if this is so promising, if this is so plausible, why are we not seeing anything?
Well, it doesn't work yet. We don't currently have any longevity interventions that work. It's just, what do we think is going to work? And
Sure, but I mean, like a multi-organ transplant like that, for somebody who's ill, if that's a look, let me put it this way to you. Let's imagine another scenario. So you're a billionaire. Your loved one is suffering of some disease, let's say cancer, and that cancer, and they're in their 70s. Now you could say, well, there's a risk they won't survive the surgery, and that's a problem. But that's a problem anyway, right? That kind of implies that, these surgeries may only be available to younger people in the first place. But let's say, for example, you have somebody in their 60s, so they can survive the surgery conceivably, and they have some cancer, and they're married to a billionaire. And the billionaire says, well, I want to give this person the best outcome. Give me the best of the best. Now, imagine that happening like hundreds of times, right? Because it is happening hundreds of times. There are people who have loved ones who are multi-hundred millionaires who are each asking their doctors about what should I do for my loved one, etc. And we're essentially saying that in none of these cases do the surgeons say something like, hey, I can get more organs, and why don't we replace the whole bit? And then you could argue, I guess maybe your argument there, just to play devil's advocate to that, is that if you don't have autologous organs, then it's completely useless because the immune response and the immune suppression level that you would need to carry out the surgery is just too high. And if that's true, then you have a different problem, which is we just don't have enough autologous organs. Would you agree with that?
that is right. Yeah. You'd much rather have someone else's liver than your own cancerous liver. But if you have a healthy old liver, you might not go for somebody else's young liver, or it might not make sense for a doctor to recommend that.
Right.
Also, we don't have doctors who specialize in multi-visceral organ transplantation. We've got kidney transplant doctors and liver transplant doctors. So I don't think many people are going to make that mental leap, like you said.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the ostensible expectation here is that once we have a large amount of autologous organs, we will naturally see some people opt to prophylactically get these organs.
Yeah, I think that's natural. Like right now, doctors wait until very late stages of disease before going for transplants. But then if we had more organs, they would do it at earlier stages, and eventually preventatively, I would think.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this all sounds plausible. It highlights that we're not there yet. because we don't have the supply of autologous organs. That's really the problem. And there's this counterfactual, which we just don't know. What would happen if you had an autologous organ to a large? Now, of course, we do have some evidence, of course, from twin studies where twins do donate different organs to one another. But I don't know if we have any evidence from twins of substantially different ages donating organs to one another. Possibly.
No, not that I know. We've heterochronic parabiosis studies that show effect sizes that are meaningful.
Not in humans.
Not in humans. But I mean, you could maybe get this to work today if you use some of the new bone marrow transplantation, co-transplantation techniques. So you can sometimes when you transfer a kidney or a liver or something, if you transplant some bone marrow also, that can make it so you don't need immunosuppressive drugs. So maybe if you're, I don't know, an evil mastermind genius and you're there and you're like, okay, I'm going to find some young person, take all their organs and some bone marrow, and maybe that would work today. You'd also need an evil surgeon to do it. But for the rest of us, we just need to wait for, mass scale organ production.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just highlight that this doesn't sound completely infeasible or implausible. Maybe it sounds even plausible to some. It does require us having a large supply of autologous organs.
Yes.
And it does require some surgical capacity and willingness to carry out these surgeries. And only then will we have actual evidence of any type to say, hey, this thing is working. Now, of course, you could argue, why don't we do this in some other animal where we can clone the animal? And I guess that's my other question for you, maybe before going into these other 2 points, the blood and nervous system relay concern and the brain. So what about other animals, right? Animals you can clone, you have an unlimited supply of autologous organs. Why can't we do this in some smaller animal and demonstrate maximum lifespan extension?
Yeah, first let me say on scaling, it's not just a requirement to generate surgical robotic systems for quality of surgery, but also to treat all the people who would theoretically need these treatments. We just won't be able to have enough human doctors to do it.
Sure.
On the animal studies, you're definitely right. We would prefer to use clones so we don't have to worry about immunosuppression. You can get isogenic animals that are close, like inbred and close enough that maybe it doesn't matter. Or maybe you can use bone marrow transplantation in the studies to make it not matter so much. But I don't think it'll be an insurmountable problem to find twin rats or twin pigs or something to test these on.
Well, I was going to say, look, humanity kills some very large number of billions of pigs per year. I'm sure pig surgery is not easy. Those animals are big and so forth. Maybe some people have argued that dogs would be a better candidate animal. But I guess there, I'm also then surprised, and I would question, so if it's plausible that even with today's surgical techniques, this could substantially extend lifespan. So you said 1 to 2 decades. I guess for a dog, that would mean if a maximum lifespan for a dog is, let's say, 15 years or 14 years for a medium-sized dog, that dog would live 16 years or something like that. I mean, certainly if they didn't make it to the current maximum, that would be suggested that this approach doesn't work. I guess what I'm wondering is, how is this not funded as an obvious study to do ASAP? And what would it take?
I don't know what kills dogs or other animals, so hard to say exactly what the impact would be. Why is it not funded? I don't know. I think
because I mean, this kind of study would probably cost like single-digit millions.
Probably.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just like if you said, "Hey, Adam, this is very plausible," and you reach some level of conviction that there's an animal study that would demonstrate it. then I'd probably say, let's go out on the road and raise whatever 3, 5, $7 million for it ASAP, because that seems like one of the lowest hanging fruits to show, something can plausibly work.
I think it'd be a good use of time.
Okay.
I've also seen you're big on praxeology. So perhaps you want to also talk a bit about how you imagine the supply problem of organs might be solved. I suppose your solution would be the free market.
Yeah, I think commercial entities would probably be the best solution for trying to generate the supply. There are many strategies for trying to produce organs. You can try to 3D print them with cells and ECM. You can try to grow them in bioreactors. You can try to grow them in animals. There's a newer technique called chimeric organgenesis, where you can mix human cells and animal cells, and then when the animal grows up, they have a human heart, and then you could take that out and give it to a person. And then there's some newer techniques for trying to grow integrated organ networks directly. So you could think of like in a vat somewhere, you have a heart and a lungs and some kidneys and things that kind of grow together so they can support each other. And then you'd have a nice set of organs to transplant for somebody. So these are different techniques and different companies are working on them, but TBD on what's actually going to work best.
Oh, what about like just people selling their own organs, either when they die or while they are alive, right? Like the blood is an organ, right? Anyone
Yeah.
should be able to go and sell some blood.
I think that would probably alleviate a lot of the strain on the organ shortage if people could sell a spare kidney. You want to put your kids through school, you don't have a lot of money, you can sell a kidney, and then good for you, good for somebody who gets the kidney. But I don't think pulling from existing human populations is going to be the ideal solution from a longevity perspective. I think we really want to develop new technologies that can not just get kidneys, but hearts. Like people can't sell their heart when they're young without dying. So, more comprehensive technological solutions.
It also doesn't sound like these non-genetically identical organs would really help from a longevity perspective. So, it's just not clear that would benefit people who are not.
Less beneficial for sure, yeah.
I mean, the evidence that I'm aware of for transplants is that when you have immunosuppression, you still have micro inflammation that's ongoing, and a lot of the drugs end up substantially raising your risk of cancer and other very negative outcomes. So this is not like a full free lunch when you get like that new kidney and it's not autologous. You have to immunosuppress, you're causing harm.
Unless the bone marrow co-transplantation makes immunosuppression unnecessary. So there may be future technologies that make it worthwhile, but I think we'd all prefer to have genetically matched organs prepared for us. Yeah.
I mean, is that, by the way, to what degree is that established, and to what degree is that effective? In other words, having non-autologous organs that have no immunosuppression requirement, but also don't create low-grade inflammation, because you may have no need for immunosuppressive drugs that have all these substantial side effects, but you're still causing low-grade inflammation, which is going to be ongoing, and it may be too early to know what the implications of that are, medium or long term.
I don't know the answer to that, but it'd be an interesting question.
Do you want to move on to the blood and nervous system? I wonder what your take on that would be, Kris, in the context of replacement.
Refresh my memory about exactly what I wanted to dig into.
It was in the context of these three wrinkles around replacement, right? Mm-hmm. So one is the trauma of the surgery, and that led us down a path of investigating, what kind of surgery could be done, what evidence we have in different dimensions. The other was that a lot of the signaling in the body happens through the blood and the nervous system. Otherwise, the different parts of the body don't know about each other really. And there was a concern that it could be that there's a certain level of signaling where if it's still delivered, would dramatically accelerate aging phenotype everywhere, regardless of how much tissue you replaced. And this also, of course, has to do with the brain, which some people believe is a primary locus driving agent, whereby, okay, if the nervous system is saying, hey, you're aged, even the new organs will start misbehaving. So to what degree do you know or have thought about that? What are you aware of in terms of the evidence, and what corrective measures are you excited about or think are reasonable?
Yeah, well, I think the science has not settled on what factors different cells and tissues are excreting and what's floating around in the blood. Like, it just hasn't been characterized yet. I also don't know which tissues and organs and glands would be most impactful for creating a holistic environment in the blood. I think we do know, though, that the more tissue you replace, the better the blood seems to look. So if you were to just replace a kidney, that might have some improvement, but you'd get a much bigger improvement if you were to replace both kidneys, your liver, and some muscles. But I don't think it's been settled at what level of replacement you actually get a flip from kind of a pro-aging inflammatory environment to one that's more youthful, or if it's just a continuum problem.
Okay. And are you aware of any interesting efforts to cleanse the blood of the aging signaling? I know there are some things that have been suspected culprits in aging signaling. Certainly different types of inflammatory markers that are more prevalent in senescent, or secreted by senescent cells and so forth. And also if you could speak to the neurological aspect, if you have perspective on that.
Yeah. So senolytics definitely seem to help. If you kill off a bunch of senescent cells that have accumulated, inflammatory signaling seems to go down. Cell therapies seem to help with inflammaging, and even just taking the factors that stem cells excrete and putting them into the bloodstream seems to depress inflammaging also. So you can sort of bring down this inflammation systemically by injecting youthful factors from cells. And that seems to persist for quite a while. So it's not just while they're in there, but you get sort of a persistent effect over the course of weeks or months from those kind of therapies. But better still to actually replace the tissues that are in your body so they can do that continuously, right? And continuously excrete factors that are beneficial and reduce inflammation. Now, in terms of the brain, I don't know if there's a particular part of the brain that is going to have an outsized effect. If there is, we might want to think about replacing that if possible, or having some sort of, I don't know, maybe new organ that can act like a super dialysis machine or something and take out the factors that are provoking inflammation. But I'm not really aware or familiar with that area.
Yeah, and by the way, there might be things that are not in the brain, like the vagus nerve and other parts of the nervous system that are also counterparts in the signaling soup. But I want to mention regarding inflammation that I'm not sure that we have the tools to measure it sufficiently. I mean, how much is inflammation important for aging, and what kind of inflammaging, and where in the body we're talking about inflammation, how local it is. So if you take a blood test and you measure your hs-CRP and it's undetectable, do you have zero inflammation in your body? No, you have some inflammation probably in some places, and you have all sorts of, let's say, deleterious signaling happening. Are you aware, or do you have a point of view about the level of measurement that we have to even understand the scope of the inflammation problem?
So not an area I'm an expert in, but I think it's pretty obvious when you look at the blood results from someone who's 80 versus 20, the level of inflammatory factors. I don't think we need like new sophisticated tests to be able to tell if we've rejuvenated somebody's bloodstream from whatever the aging phenotype is. So if you have inflammaging and you take some therapy from a secretome company that's like collecting the what is being excreted from stem cells, and you inject into somebody, the charts that I've seen are pretty obvious. Like you get massive reductions in inflammatory factors. It's not something that we need new tests for.
Okay.
For what it's worth, I just quickly took a look at the Longevity World Cup's silent generation, 2 participants, and their CRPs are, so they are 80 and 81 years old, and their CRPs are 0.55 and 0.26. So at least with them, yeah, it's not happening if we believe in CRP.
Yeah. Which suggests, it's just like this bigger concern around the scope of understanding and measurement. And in that, maybe I would echo what Kris said, that there are things, maybe CRP is not the right thing, but there are measures that would definitely tell us if somebody were rejuvenated. One of my favorites is maximum heart rate. I mean, I would challenge you to show me an 80-year-old with a maximum heart rate of 200. I don't believe that exists. And so a lot of this kind of fetishization of measurement is just a detour from the fact we just don't have therapies that work. So now, of course, you could say, well, you want to know if something works even a little bit to start going down that path, and that could be argued about. But we definitely don't have anything that would work, and it's not a problem that we wouldn't be able to tell if it worked, in case it worked well. Kris, what do you think about the third topic, the issue of the brain? Because just going back to this notion of, okay, what you made this argument 1 or 2 decades of maximum lifespan extension, or even life expectancy extension. When the modal age of death is 87 in many countries, we're talking about like getting somebody to like 100 or 107. Sounds like a really big deal to me, even if we didn't take the maximum lifespan extension, which it seems you would also stand behind. What about the brain?
I think the brain is the exact reason why you're not getting, I'm not saying 200 years or 300 years with replacement. It's because we don't have a good strategy around replacing the brain. Because if you did, the brain's going to be the limiting factor. If you replace all your heart, your internal organs, your arms and legs, your brain will still age at some rate, and eventually you'll die because of that. But if we could replace the brain, and essentially everything then becomes replaceable, and you can theoretically just keep replacing things and staying young that way. Unfortunately, you can't just pull your brain out and put a new one, right? That will kill you. So how do you actually do replacement of the brain? There are kind of 2 strategies right now. One is cellular replacement, where you get young cells and you inject them into the body so they can go to the brain and take over the work of the existing cells. That is not foolproof because you still have to deal with the aging ECM in the brain, the extracellular matrix. If the ECM is old, it will make young cells behave old. So even if you inject a lot of young cells into the brain, they'll misbehave, and if they're on old ECM. Maybe you can get young cells to replace the ECM. I'm not aware of any solution for doing that yet, but future technology might develop that. The other proposal is to do tissue transplantation in the brain, where you take out small volumes of your brain. Well, first you silence them so they're not used, so the functions of that area can go somewhere else in the brain. Then you take out the silenced area and you put in young tissue. And then that young tissue grows and then takes over functions that are from other parts of the brain. If you do that enough, you could eventually replace the whole brain. Unfortunately, that requires routine brain surgery, so it's not all that appealing. But open to other suggestions if you guys have ideas.
Well, and it's not clear that strategy is applicable to all parts of the brain. For example, the brain stem.
Right. Certain parts of the brain might not need progressive replacement like that. You may be able to just create artificial replacements and swap them directly, or even biological ones, if you find ways to connect the different regions in the brain. What determines your personality is not distributed evenly throughout the whole brain, right? There are some areas that are more important than others. So we might find that the brainstem is just keeping our heart beating and our diaphragm moving. And so a generic brainstem might be good enough. But I'm also not an expert in neuroanatomy.
Yeah, one of the things that I land on when I hear these descriptions and the analysis of the concerns, the wrinkles, is that eventually you've ended a point where you are modifying what it means to be human. So, like, this is not, because you can imagine a scenario where you had an autologous clone and you collected organs or tissue from that autologous clone, and there were some manner of replacement that would feel very seamless. And you could say, for almost all intents and purposes, you are still the same biologically as you were previously. Mm-hmm. But the more we're digging into these different conceivable paths, it seems that that is a less likely outcome, that at the end, you'll have to do something which really quite substantially departs from what it is to be human right now. I mean, this idea of a ship of Theseus, continuous replacement of parts of the brain until, like, in a seamless way, the whole brain over a multitude of surgeries has been now replaced with new cells, just like the body recycles cells all over the place, would be kind of a simulation of existing biology, and it would be maybe close enough. But it really sounds like even that just wouldn't really fully work because of different other concerns. And the reason I say this is because it almost seems like if what you want is to maintain some continuity of self, and that's your goal by extending lifespans, of course, with quality of life and so forth, then the path of least resistance seems much more likely to be artificial than biological replacement. That's kind of where I land there. Whereas if you want to maintain biology, the path of least resistance is probably, and maybe more difficultly, bioengineering.
Yeah, excellent points. So on the artificial replacement, I think if your goal is to save as many people as possible, save the people you care about, you should be opportunistic and take artificial replacements where available or where that's easier, and take biological where that's easier or more available. So if someone develops an artificial liver in the next decade that's scalable and available and easier to get than a biological one, then yeah, obviously take that artificial liver if you can get one. Does that make you not human? I don't know. I think that becomes more of a question when you start swapping out parts of the brain with like brain-computer interfaces or things like that. But your second point's an interesting one that many people fail to realize is we're not limited to just replacement, right? Bioengineering could unlock solutions to some of the problems that replacement has a hard time with. And so we really want to take all of these different strategies and combine them into solutions that will help people.
Yeah, I think ultimately you make a good point by saying that even today, people take artificial organs and they don't consider themselves to be different humans now that they have that artificial heart or artificial pancreas, or they have to go on dialysis because their kidneys failed or were removed or whatever. And that's what makes me very biased that if the trajectory is not modified, where we will end up is with some sort of cyborgization of humanity, because those kind of interventions are accelerating at a substantial rate, and they are fully acceptable as they're incremental. They feel incremental, right? You give a BMI to a quadriplegic and then to a paraplegic, and then you replace an organ because it's failing, and then before you know it, you're in a Battle Angel Alita, scenario. It feels like that's the path that we're on. Now, you could say, by the way, that, oh, well, I have a problem with that, and I'm concerned about longevity because it won't happen in my lifetime, so I won't get to benefit, right? But a lot of people, when they look at that and they accept that this is the end point of the trajectory would say, oh, hey, hold on a second. I'm not sure I want to live in a Battle Angel Alita world where all that's left is, the brain of some type. And of course, I would just say, like, look, ultimately, if the brain degrades, let's just imagine you had an artificial replacement for the entire body, your entire organ system, etc. Or let's, some people will call that a brain in a vat, right? Some sort of RoboCop scenario. The brain will continue aging. And so ultimately, you still need to deal with the biological realities of the brain. And you would either solve that with bioengineering, or you would say, well, now you're already interfacing the brain in some extremely deep way with the rest of this new body that you have. So you ostensibly understand something about neurological signaling and communication, ways that are more sophisticated than today, quite considerably. And then it seems plausible to me that you're essentially going down this path of like mind uploading. You're going to have you're already fused with technology, which is not what we would think about the current, biology of being human. And it's much more plausible that instead of trying to figure out how to keep that brain meat, bioengineering in the state that it is, you would find a way to carry out uploading. I spoke about this with Professor Masa Watanabe from University of Tokyo. He spoke at Vitalist Bay, and his idea about how to do this is by severing the corpus callosum, because that's the only place in the brain where you have a number of neural fibers that's possible to interface with today's miniaturization technology. So if you try to enter the brain or replace a part of the brain from the neocortex, your problem is that there's a incredibly complicated tangle of webs inside the deep brain. And you're going to be traumatizing that and causing all sorts of problems. Whereas with the corpus callosum, you only have 1 million nerve fibers. So it's conceivable that you could have a mesh of 1 million nerve receiving fibers. And you could essentially, and this surgery is already done today for people who have some severe epilepsy. And so what you would do is you would sever the corpus callosum, you would retain the communication between both lobes initially, but you would also send the signal and amplify the signal to a third lobe. And that would be your path towards some sort of movement out of the biological substrate. I guess my point is that, it may be a Luddite perspective if you label it negatively, but a lot of people, if you propose to them that that is their future in 50 or 60 years, or that is their children's future, would be quite appalled.
Yeah, I mean, we just want to give people options. We don't want to force people to do anything they don't want to do. I do think eventually there will be bioengineering only solutions to aging, but they're kind of farther out. So probably today we've got replacement options for hips and lenses in your eyes and things, and there'll probably be a lot more replacement stuff available before there's an injection that just keeps you biologically then forever. So hopefully we can get that developed as quickly as possible so those people don't have to make the hard choice of, do I want to die or get some sort of weird BCI thing? But hard to predict when these things are going to happen. Though I think brain emulation is, from what I've heard, is probably decades away just because of the compute needed. So in the meantime, we've got a lot of people who are going to die if we don't come up with other solutions.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that this would be a weird or maybe sound weird to some people. I guess a question in following up in your understanding of human psychology. You're a business person, you've built and sold companies. Do you imagine a scenario where artificial augmentation and or replacement confers substantial advantages, where the game mechanics would allow people to elect to stay biologically human? And what I mean by that is that typically the game mechanics of human history are that when a group has some advantage, a technological advantage, of course, we're not talking about augmentation, but, gunpowder and muskets are a type of external augmentation of your way to project your intentions on the world, typically what happens is the population that doesn't adopt the augmentation either gets eradicated or subjugated. That's very, you could call that sad or whatever you want to call it, but that seems to be the human pattern.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a historian, but the world, as far as I know, is getting more peaceful. So we might end up in a situation where people who don't adopt new technologies or enhancements become kind of like the Amish. They're just chilling, doing their thing, and living life the way they want to, and other people don't bother them. But it could become more of a medieval situation. Hard to say.
Actually, I do have a bit of an experience with mind uploading or a earlier form of it, because just a few weeks ago I cloned myself. Imagine a chat bot that believes that it's me, right? And you can actually talk to that person and using the same annoying accent that I have right now. And you can do it right now if you want. It's pontio.io/pb/Adam Fiskor. The point is that look, they created this persona who believes it's me, and I can talk to myself, right? It's a surreal experience to talk to yourself. I often ask myself about ideas instead of ChatGPT because I know we are on the same
Same wavelength, yeah.
same wavelength. That's right. But look, I don't like. It doesn't feel to me that it's like I uploaded my mind, therefore I did anything for my longevity here. Perhaps my kids can talk to me, or many generations down the line, right? They can talk to me, which is nice. Perhaps it could eventually I could make it an autonomous agent on the internet, and that's really like a mind upload. That's kind of like a mind upload. I would still prefer it to be my slave, though. But still, this is just not satisfying enough when it comes to longevity.
Well, when people talk about these kind of merger scenarios, which I think a lot of people are assuming to be the base case right now in the trajectory, they often are supposing that your sense of self extends to the new substrate. So we're not talking about a cloning or a duplication, but rather an extension of your sense of self. And I would just say,
you have to discontinue the previous sense of self.
Well, I mean, if you discontinue, then you're creating potential, undesirable outcomes for people. Now, I want to just double click on something that Kris said, which is that you could say, well, the world is getting more peaceful, and wouldn't it be great? And I know this is not exactly the framing that you used, Kris, but wouldn't it be great if we could all just get along, and if people want to live like this, they can live like this, and other people want to, merge. I think that's a pretty fair, optimistic kind of version of the world, one version of the world that, one may aspire to. I guess that what is a little difficult with that is that if you take a position that we have agency to define where we're going, it puts the onus on us to make some choices and not leave it to chance. And right now, things are going in a certain direction. And so if we believe something about humanity and what is good and just and positive, then we need to exert our agency to make sure that that happens, rather than something which is kind of a base default.
Totally agree.
Does that mean that you would, what is your position in that case in terms of strategies around resource allocation? So like just to give an example to spice it up a little bit. So here you are, let's say president of the US or president of China. Let's say president of China for the sake of argument here. We're Americans, and so forth. And you think that China has the best culture and you want China to be dominant because that's where you think that'll benefit the most people. You genuinely believe that. And you also have a concept of what it means to be human. And you may have gone where you are as president of China in this or that way. But assuming you have some aspiration for humanity and you have some mental model of what is good about being human, right? Because like even the worst dictator, well, they can't dictate anything if they're the only human left in the world, right? So, or it's not a very useful construct for them. So even the worst dictator lives in some ecosystem of how they think about like society and their interface with society, as far as humans are, at least today. And so if you are in that position and you say, well, the easiest way for us is to dominate the world is to augment. And why don't we just augment? We'll make super soldiers, and those soldiers will be just like we'll create experiments and we'll merge them with technology. So they'll immediately be able to interface with AI seamlessly. And yeah, it'll be like a kind of nasty surgery, but hey, it's all right. That's what they signed up for, and it's worth it for the greater good. They could have died at war. So, having a corpus callosum severed and connecting to the AI, could be worse. And we're going to give them some really dope bionic hands and, some other cool stuff. I guess my point is when I think about that scenario where somebody has a lot of power and they could elect to go down that path, they would still not do that if they thought, or something would hold them back from doing that if they thought there's some limit in how much you want to and how fast you want to merge with technology, in terms of kind of a species level concern. And I wonder how you think about that and whether there should be any boundaries, or if you were whispering to a person, or if you were in a position of great power, how you would think about the allocation of attention and resources to promote these different strategies, artificial replacement, biological replacement, or bioengineering, because, I get it when you're a beggar. Yeah, sure. Be opportunistic. Hey, my dad's dying. I need some liver. Give me whatever you got, doc. I get it. But, we're very privileged to be around people who are high agency and who do have influence in some positions. And so I wonder what you would say, in an affirmative way. How would you govern it?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no single person who's going to figure this out on their own. And like you've said in the past, we need to let 1,000 flowers bloom. So the best strategy is really to get out of the way and let people try things. So in a particular country, you could make it legal to produce therapies and try them and let people volunteer to experiment on themselves and try them out and see if they work. That's really how you're going to get the fastest technological progress. If there were if we knew that there were a strategy that would work pretty quickly and just required a huge amount of money, like say replacement was we didn't have the brain problem in replacement, and we knew we just needed organs and it was going to work and everyone was going to live to 200, then maybe you could have some dictators say, we're just going to dump 10% of the GDP into this organ generation stuff and get it done as quickly as possible. But we really don't have a view into what's going to work to solve aging, and we would need people to try lots of different things. And no dictator is gonna be able to tell you what to try.
Mm-hmm. It's almost as if I would paraphrase what you said, it's that on the balance, we are far enough from technological inflection that the primary concern needs to be accelerating progress. And because a kind of decentralized, unregulated approach, or, an open-ended approach is likely going to produce more acceleration, that outweighs the concern of the specific form that it would take. Even if you acknowledge that human behaviors and game mechanics and prisoner dilemmas or other situations may produce risky outcomes.
Yeah. I think that's right. And governments can have influence, and they can try to do less harm and get in the way less. They can try to supply more funding and propel things that way. But at the end of the day, people like us just need to try things and see what works.
And the governments to get out of the way. No.
Well, I mean, I don't know about getting out of the way. The governments, you ideally want them to be a positive function in this story because they coordinate so many resources, legitimacy, they do define policies. And there are certain, guardrails that, I mean, if you lived in kind of a full anarchy, I don't think that we would benefit from enhanced technological progress, right?
I disagree with that.
There are different perspectives on this. They're strong. I would call it strong libertarian perspectives that would argue that, but there are also I forget what it's called. Minimal government perspectives that try to protect certain things that the commons don't seem to be able to provide.
Happy to have the minarchism versus anarchism debate at some point, but it's a little tangential to longevity. I think we're just so far from it that it's not going to influence how quickly we solve aging at this point.
I have my own views on this, but it's important to note that Kris actually wrote a book on this, so you might wanna put some more words in this topic, I think.
So I guess my question to you, Kris, then, given this kind of an analysis of where things are, how does one achieve maximum acceleration? What is your mental model at doing that, given the levers available?
It's got to pull them all. And just because the government shouldn't exist doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I agree with you that we should be trying to leverage it to make progress and thereby save more lives. It's not just about government, though. There are private institutions, there are social platforms, there are companies, and I don't know every avenue, but I want to help people explore every avenue so we have the best chance of solving this problem as quickly as we can.
What do you think is most plausible?
Most plausible? I don't know. My viewpoint's pretty limited. I do angel investing to try to help young companies get off the ground so they can develop therapies and hopefully get them into the hands of patients. I try to help with technological development or the promotion of longevity-related ideas. I'm not really an expert in government and trying to get non-dilutive funding for projects or get research labs the funding they need to do the experiments like we talked about earlier, where you see how many organs you need to replace to actually make a difference. But I think, like you said, like you've said in the past, getting people together to focus on the goal and push in whatever areas they have expertise in or influence in is really the only way to make rapid progress.
What do you think, Adam?
The way I look at our current state is that until AI came on the scene, there was no hope of a deus ex machina that would accelerate things agnostically outside of deliberate pressure for innovation and our ability to impact biology and aging. And so my mental model was, and to some degree still is, that all of the efforts combined are substantially below what would be adequate to make any progress towards the scope. So what I mean, and this is a unpopular position, in the longevity space. It's an unpopular position, period. I commented in this vein when I wrote recently that Calico just, had this, I don't know if it was a wind down, but not undesirable outcome after billions of dollars, a collaboration with AbbVie, and something like 13 or more years. And I just wrote, hey, this is a cautionary tale of how little you can do with billions of dollars. And when you fetishize some scientific approach or some strategy that you think you know best of, that you'll make substantial progress in solving this problem, which is the greatest problem in human existence. Okay. Like it's in that sense, I think Kris and I are exactly on the same page. We're far. We need to take lots of shots on goal from different directions and different dimensions. And so you look at Pfizer, their annual R&D budget is $14 billion. You think that like some company, they got $3 billion over 10 years and basically mostly recruits academics who, what they say, you can take the academics out of academia, but not academia out of academics, are doing the same kind of work that they were doing previously, just now making 3 times as much in some different situation. Like, and by the way, that effort too is a blessed effort. I'm grateful that that is happening. It's great. And maybe we'll get stuff that is good out of it. But to think that this is some sort of potential plausible path is irrational. It's just not, it doesn't converse with reality. And so what that means is that when you look at the entire ecosystem, people trying anything, it's really very close to nothing. And so when you have something that's very close to nothing, of course, it's not nothing, and we need these things to happen. You need to think about change in a way that moves the needle outside of that context. You see what I mean? So if you ask, it's almost like asking a horse and buggy, hey, what would you do to improve the transportation world? And they'd be like, well, I would breed faster horses. You know what I mean? Like the context, when you look at some ecosystem, is often to amplify things in the mental models that already exist. But that's not going to work for this. So that's why Vitalism Foundation and Vitalism talks about applying the necessary attention to this issue. And that means attention at the highest level. So how can you sit there and say, hey, there's any plausibility that we're going to make progress? Just like in a common sense, plain English, here we are knowing nothing about this, just having coffee, or for the person on the street, right? It's plausible we're going to make progress on this most difficult problem in existence when we spend 100th of the resources that we spend on cancer, when we have 100th of the people spending their attention to try to solve it scientifically, when we have almost no regulatory or systemic affordances that make it likely or attractive for people to put their attention there. And for the market also, just speaking to what Kris was defining in terms of opening the ecosystem for different types of players, including commercial players, when you make it impossible for there to be commercial motive because of all sorts of restrictions, you're just dead in the water. You can't do anything. And so that's why my perspective is that you really have to operate at a scope that can move the needle in terms of attention, at least an order of magnitude, probably 2 orders of magnitude from where it is today. And the story that some people tell, which is, my company is so great and my idea is so great that when my thing gets approved or when my thing shows the breakthrough, then everybody will see, and that will be the lever that will just suddenly move at an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude level.
I've heard that once or twice.
It's just like, probably not. Like, maybe something will happen, but do I want to bet my life on it? Like, I hope that your awesome strategy works. Maybe it'll make a lot of money, but is it really likely to move the needle in this way? So that's my take on it. And that's why with my attention, I try to focus on wealth creation with Vitalism Foundation, building an ecosystem and moving the needle on attention. And that means partially at the state level, but also, getting people who are in the private and commercial ecosystem to align with this and to support and create more pressure in this direction, right? Like if you look at, for example, American dynamism, it's not one thing. It's an ideology. Who supports that ideology? Well, Anduril builds weapons, and Palantir builds surveillance systems, and other companies build energy, and there are people in government who support American dynamism for their own reasons. You know what I mean? Like, and without supporting that, just saying ideologies typically do need ecosystems to thrive and to accelerate. And right now, there's very little of that happening in the longevity space. Still, even though Vitalism is moving in that direction, Vitalism Foundation is trying to push as hard as possible. But it's natural that this hasn't existed until recently because nascent ecosystems just don't have enough people or resources to even think about something at a larger scope than just struggling to get that extra $1 million. Like Kris was saying, some of these studies that are very promising can't even get like a few $100,000. That's unfortunately where we are.
Yeah, totally agree that getting more people paying attention and more mind share could be a huge accelerant. This is not really my area, so I'm curious. We talked a little bit about technological barriers and milestones, but on the social side, where do you see us at in terms of that attention and what would it look like, or what would it take to get to the 10x or 100x attention from the general population and people who have resources to deploy?
I generally don't think that attention from the general population is a necessity, but it's also an accelerant, and it is desirable if you can get it. The way I look at our current state is that there are secular trends that are pushing a confrontation with this problem, regardless of the longevity ecosystem. Those trends have to do with insolvent economies. They have to do with aging populations who are suddenly converging on, hey, we all want to feel and look younger, and a larger part of the control of society, people call it derogatorily a gerontocracy, is now riddled with these concerns. But those are also the people who have power, right? It's not like the American Revolution. Who were the people in power? People in their 30s and 40s. So very different situation. And so more people are confronting this, people entering middle age who have, let's say, a stronger belief in science and technology, creating a better world, a little bit of a pendulum swing there, and maybe a bifurcation in society. And those people are overwhelmed by social media that tells them they should look perfect and young all the time. And so there's this kind of source of gravity pushing society to also address it. And there is some scientific progress that indicates that bioengineering or innovative interventions are possible and plausible, both because we know that, for example, there are longevity genes, and now we know that we can do gene therapies. So you take those two together and you say, okay, so you don't need to be Einstein to say, hey, maybe we can give these genes to some random person. They will live longer, right? Like a centenarian, and will escape these diseases and other things which are universally known as bad. So how do we make progress? Broadly speaking, there are two appealing paths or let's say plausible paths in my mind. One is that, and I think this is a considerably less plausible path, but it might still happen over a much longer period. There will be this kind of escalation of pressures that will produce more outputs in terms of decision making on the attention policy capital side. What do I mean by that? So you could look at Peter Attia, David Sinclair, Andrew Huberman, Brian Johnson, and just be like, it just so happened that all these guys suddenly became famous right around the same time and are growing in attention and audience and influence, right? I just find that very implausible. These people are emerging because there's kind of this latent demand, which is pulling them out from the sidelines, out of the woodwork. And so you could argue that society as a whole is creating these influence loci, and then the demand spills over into commercial needs. So it's expressed in Blueprint, but it's also expressed in companies like Function Health or PagelessRx or, Matthew Walker's companies that have to do with sleep optimization or wearables or you name it. So in other words, what you'll see is there's kind of this agnostic secular process, and over 5, 10, 15, 20 years, there will be more investment in prevention, addressing aging, confronting aging, etc. Fundamentally, there are two deficits to this pathway, because you could try to be more deliberate in accelerating. You could join Brian Johnson, try to grow his effort. You could, try to become an influencer yourself or start a company that would be selling some prevention or something in this vein. The two deficits are, number one, it's very unpredictable. So you're essentially saying, hey, I'm going to cast my, bread on the water and hope that this is going to be fine and these things will kind of emerge. And number two, the type of strategies that emerge from this kind of grassroots influence or more of the public caring about this over time pathway are not necessarily efficient in terms of solving aging. So what they may produce are things that are, somewhat preventative of certain age-related
More supplements.
Maybe they produce some, strategies that do have a midterm, medium-term effect on lifespan extension or maximum lifespan extension. It's just very unpredictable because it's not deliberate and there isn't a systematic ideology behind it. I mean, even though, of course, Brian Johnson has his ideology, but he's one player and there are multiple players in this game. And when you try to introduce the commercial motive, what ends up happening is you essentially end up in what I would call a commodity market. So when somebody says, hey, join my blood testing service and it will make your biological age as low as possible or lower than all these other garbage blood testing services. But all of the services are saying the same thing about everybody else, right? And so it ends up being this kind of red ocean, and that creates a lot of difficulty. The strategy that Vitalism Foundation is pursuing, which seems to be a lot more plausible, is what we call an influence network or a strategic network. And that's essentially getting a small number of people, maybe between 200 and 2,000, who are high leverage to be more deliberate in trying to cause change. And this is not us inventing the wheel. It's true of like the American Dynamism movement. It's true of interest groups like the pharma lobby has their own interests, which combines commercial, and they also have some ideology that they believe in. And so the idea is, just to go back to your initial question, Kris, of, okay, what are the stepping stones that you might see? Because the first pathway that are articulated, the stepping stones are kind of vague because it's harder to predict. Whereas with a more deliberate strategy, you could say, well, okay, right now, just last week, there was the MAHA Summit. And Jim O'Neill, who's Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services, which is a department that oversees trillions of dollars, was hosting a panel under the banner, like a literal big banner that said reversing aging and brain-machine interface, accelerating reversing aging and brain-machine interfaces, or something like that. This is probably the first time in history that so senior a member of any government, let alone the most powerful probably government in the world, was hosting anything under that banner. I mean, even the words reversing aging. If you think about the entire longevity world, typically it goes from slow, stop, reverse in levels of like conservatism, right? And most people are like in the slow category. Most companies in the longevity ecosystem, actually, they're in the slow category. They say, we're working on slowing aging. And if we manage to just reduce the slope by a little bit, that would be a huge win. And I'm talking about, by the way, about people who are vitalists. Like, they want to live as long as possible. They want to live in great health. They're not like some sort of Luddites. They're still aiming for slow. So for the word reverse to appear in that kind of scenario is really meaningful because it projects downward everywhere, right? Because like you could think about it, let's say very mechanistically and say, well, how much money is going to exactly go to what exact project? And that is a perfectly legitimate way to think about it. And we can talk about that in a second. But it also does matter when you know that your boss and your boss's boss and your boss's 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 boss cares about reversing aging. Yeah. That's going to impact how you think about your projects, right? Because you know that that's the guidance from the leadership of your organization. So one thing is helping people who are in positions of influence like that and getting more people in positions of influence like that who are ideologically aligned. And when you look at the positions, it's, again, probably something like 200 to 1,000 positions in the world. Maybe you could say, you could break it down by country. So you could say, well, in one country, there are also 200 to 1,000 positions like that. What are those key positions? Of course, you have senior positions in government. So in the US, that would be like, for example, you have all the ABC soup, right? FDA, CMS, NIH, NIA, HHS. And within all these orgs, they're such massive orgs. And by the way, a lot of the people in those orgs, they want people to be well, and they want health to be greater and longer. So they're somewhat aligned, but maybe very aligned, but you want to make some reforms in how you're allocating resources. So you need support internally, and you need enough of that kind of middle management and the people who do different work on the ground to support this. And that's why I'm saying it's not like 10 people. It's not even 100 people. It's probably more like 1,000 people who can really drive the course. Now, you have organizations like ARPA-H, where a single program manager can probably move hundreds of millions of dollars in one tenure, which is a 3-year affair. And so, you know, ARPA-H has a budget of about $1 billion, $1.5 billion a year, maybe 20 to 30 program managers. I mean, if you had 5 program managers who were working on technologies that were accelerants for these common goals, and which may have dual purpose, that also either solves disease or services other needs for society, perfectly great. And in fact, that's of course desirable. Then you can make a huge impact. And right now, so this is on the government side. There's of course more there too, but you also have the private industry. So can you get more companies to align with this? And there are companies, for example, the large AI companies, Demis, Dario, Sam, so Anthropic, OpenAI, and DeepMind, et cetera. They're all basically vitalists. So they talk about extending lifespans. They talk about eradicating all disease, et cetera, et cetera. So how can they be more engaged to try to create an ecosystem that accelerates this? And they're doing some good stuff, but I think that there could be considerably more done. So you want more of these kind of leaders in key companies to be aligned with these efforts, so that they're not working in isolation, but in some sort of coordination, right? And that's loose coordination. This isn't some sort of like weird
longevity congress or something.
Yeah, they're not like these. Often these groups that want to see something change in the world are like women's suffrage or whatever. There isn't like a central committee of women's suffrage that decided what everybody's going to do. There are different people who think, you know, people having better outcomes is important. And so they collaborate on different things. And Vitals and Foundation's role in this is to help manifest that much more effectively and faster, because left to their own devices, the different stakeholders in this potential story actually don't, it's like a tragedy of the commons. They don't have an incentive to communicate with each other or to coordinate. So to give you one example, there have been cases where I've been asked about recommendations for certain positions, and I literally don't have more than 2 or 3 names that I can mention. And why is that? And I know, Kris, that you've been in a similar position for certain questions. It's because nobody has taken the time to communicate with enough people to evaluate whether they'd have an interest or maybe a fit for the specific roles. You can't just pull some random person off the street and put them in a meaningful role in the health world, because this has so many implications. And so when you ask, okay, how can we accelerate? I would just boil it down to leverage. And if you can just coordinate people, identify them, create some levers like that, and then get the influence to compound, it's probably the cheapest way that you can make progress.
So do you think that's more getting people aligned and running in the same direction, or getting people excited?
Oh, it's definitely getting them aligned and running in the same direction, but I wouldn't say exactly aligned. It's more running in the same direction. And what I mean by that is, so there are a lot of people out there who care about this stuff. Some people have, variations of how they care about it. But when I say running in the same direction, what I mean is not that they're running in opposite directions. It's that they're not running. If you're sitting and you're at your lab and you have a budget of $5 million a year or $15 million a year, and I come to you and I say, hey, ABC, they're recruiting a new head of the NIH, a $60 billion a year organization. And you tell me, well, I don't want to deal with the politics, yada, yada. Okay, well, I'm sorry, you're not running. You are walking or crawling. And if I can't get somebody to agree to take some of these roles, I mean, obviously, I'm not their boss. I can only talk to people and see if they may be a fit and encourage them. And I'm not the decider anyway of who's going to be in what role. But if somebody is asking me for a recommendation and I want to recommend somebody, then I need to have somebody who wants to run, who wants to participate and lead and accelerate things. And we don't even have that.
Yeah.
I mean, we have very little of it.
We have scientists who don't want to run things, but
among other things. I mean, there are also people who don't want to start companies, even though a company structure would be the best mechanism to accelerate or to get capital. This problem exists on all dimensions, but I think it's possible to unlock a lot just by connecting people, coordinating, creating venues where they have the right incentives. And that does take some money. Like, we can't do this on zero, but we could probably make a lot of progress with millions of dollars a year, not with billions.
So I just want to say that I am on a mission to solve aging myself. So it would not be a good idea to not actually present my plan here to you guys, because you mentioned breeding faster horses, and that's pretty much what my approach is here. So here is my plan of how I'm planning to solve aging, and I hope it's plausible. Well, you guys tell me if it's plausible to you. Okay, I'm starting with the longevity competition, single biological aging clock. People are competing with each other on getting their biological aging clock down. Okay, so how do we get to solving aging from here? Well, we add another biological aging clock. Well, it turns out all the biological aging clocks come with a bunch of other markers. So if you buy a true diagnostic test or glycan age test or anything, you get a host of other data, and the users are uploading all the data. And eventually we end up with a website where people are competing with each other on a bunch of different various biomarkers, data points, whatever, but there is the World Cup of aging, the competition of aging. Now we starting to have something, but still, how do we actually solve aging here? Okay, individuals can try to do this and that, but let's say what do we have in the Formula One races, that there are these constructors league, right? What happens there is that big companies come and run a couple of pilots, and they make those people, or in the longevity World Cup sense, now the big pharma companies are coming in, and the athletes are getting to, they are trying to make the athletes as good for the competition as possible. So now we end up with a race where big money is bringing in, is trying stuff out with their own athletes on a bunch of different relevant metrics. And you see, now we have an actual race of trying to make certain people's life faster and longer, or healthier. The older you are, the more chances you have in the race. So the older person you rejuvenate, the better you get over time. And okay, so we have to succeed with at least a couple of these sport people, right? Like, we are going to come up with something that we are controlling these people's lives, right? Like, all the athletes at the highest level, they live like monks because they have to focus on playing, being the best in their game, and they cannot go out and party and whatnot. So now we have these people. But then again, if we achieve success with these people, then how far are we from achieving success with the rest of us, right?
I mean,
So it sounds like in your ideal scenario, you've got a bunch of competitors who are living healthy and showing other people how to do it. You've got some attention. People are watching the stats, or maybe a reality TV show or something. And then you have advertisers or sponsors who are bringing in money. And then what's the next step after you've got this little ecosystem?
Or a big ecosystem.
Or big, yeah. What's the next step after your big ecosystem? Are you going to try and leverage that to develop new technology, or inspire people to do research?
I'm not doing that. They are doing that. The athletes who are doing well, and the companies who are sponsoring the athletes.
yes,
Who are running the lives of the athletes.
Oh, I see. So the
emergent discoveries because of the competition.
I see. It'd be a bit like a better version of Survivor, where like the best competitors are just staying alive and healthy throughout each season of the show.
Well, look, you're free to smile on it, but if you wouldn't, I probably wouldn't be doing this, because then everyone else would be doing this, right? But this is something I strongly believe.
Well, I mean, there are two questions, if you don't mind, just to bring up in this.
Sure.
How plausible is it that technological innovation will happen as a result of these incentives? And given the kind of resources that may be available, whether it's the participants or the people supporting them or the companies that they're involved and so forth. And you could say, well, I think the conservative scientific view that many in the longevity community may have is that the likelihood of major scientific discoveries or breakthroughs is very low in this strategy. But there might be minor discoveries that are useful, and maybe the likelihood of those is actually pretty high. So just to give an example on that, you have these viruses like Epstein-Barr virus, which now we know causes, multiple, or really radically increases the chance of getting multiple sclerosis, or other things that where we just don't know enough about them. And there might be some discoveries that really do augment and enhance and improve health, and maybe even mean lifespan or maximum lifespan. I wouldn't reject that out of hand. It's just like people didn't believe the bacterial hypothesis about the cause of ulcers until the guy like literally caused an ulcer by having to drink it and then curing himself, right? Like, so I think there could be different low-hanging fruits that are discovered in this manner. However, it will likely not unlock a step function change of the type that we were discussing previously. This is at least my guess when you look at this kind of thing. And that's why I would just say is the qualifier for this to be compelling is it must become very popular. It must become very big. And so very big, you can put a number on that, 500,000, million people, or whatever number, probably some very large number like that, maybe a lot larger. And then the question is, because it has an impact on the general public, not just on innovation, because it's a public thing, then the kind of onus that I would put on it is to also convey a positive ideology. So Brian Johnson is conveying a positive ideology. He's saying, don't die. Take care of yourself. Be well. Whereas some people say it's not the lifespan. It's the health span. Lifespan doesn't matter. And I would say that's very problematic, because if that's your perspective as in a position of some sort of leadership, that has a lot of ramification about where the money might go, right? If it's not about the lifespan, it's about the health span, maybe what we should do is just give everybody free yoga classes or free equinox passes. You know what I'm saying? I don't mean that facetiously. Those interventions would probably create a lot of value for a lot of people. And we need to choose, is that where we want to put our money, or do we want to put our money in fundamental science?
Yeah, I'll add one other thing that I think is interesting about your approach, and that is people who are competing and have access to therapies in different regulatory zones will build their stack, right? They'll be like, I've got X gene therapy and X supplements and X whatever exercise routine, and that'll lead to some benefit in my biological clock. And then if people can see what people are using, like if it's kind of an open stack, then people can adopt different strategies and see how it impacts them. And that could generate a lot of interest in using all therapies that are not approved yet, so we get early data on how they work, and also give a boost to companies who are trying to bring early access to therapies. So right now you have to go to Mexico or Honduras to get certain gene therapies, but if that could become more mainstream and right to try states in the US or other localities that have more money and people, you could have a big impact that way through this mechanism of bringing broader appeal and broader experimentation. So I definitely could see a benefit from that. But like Adam, I agree. For true step function changes in lifespan, we need more radical technological innovation.
All righty. So firstly, the only concern I have here is the popularity stuff. Like, how can you make it so popular that big money is flowing through it, like, let's say, like basketball, right? Like, huge money is flowing through it. On the other hand, is it plausible that a competition can get us to the breakthroughs? I think it's the most plausible things, because if you look at any other sport, this is the only territory in the entire human existence where people can actually hyper focus on something, like sport, a game, but even just a computer game, when you sit down and you don't do anything, just hyper focusing on a game, you're a completely different person. But a sportman is like a high level sportman is like his entire being is, I am the ball, and so when what does it result to? Risk taking. They are going to take risks that otherwise would be unethical to do a study on, let's say, bodybuilders are using all kinds of stuff. Those are completely illegal. So they're taking illegal risks. But you're not gonna be a Mr. Olympia if you want a study for everything that you're taking, right? If you want enough evidence for those things, sometimes just gonna fuck around and find out. Well, thank you guys for coming to this.
No, thank you so much. Great conversation. Always love talking about this stuff.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Kris, if you want to just plug anything, or if, or mention where you can be found, that's probably important. Where can people find you? How can they get in touch with you?
Hey, just go to chrisborer.com.
Okay, cool. And on my end,
How it is
so Adam Gries, my full name, on X. And of course, I encourage you to join us at Vitalism, vitalism.io, or vitalistbay.com, which is our annual conference, the biggest longevity conference, which is going to happen next May 2020.
Highly recommend it. I went to the last one. It was great.